And I think it's difficult. It's a very difficult question to try and answer, and I think the medical sciences are really giving it a good bash in terms of trying to identify all those aspects. But I think for this conversation, just to understand that it's very much an individual thing. It's age dependent, it's gender specific, it's related to how much sleep you've had. It changes on a day-to-day basis. So it's very difficult to quantify and give you a number, or give you, you run 10 Ks in a week, or you're overtrained, or you throw 40,000 balls, you're overdone. It's very, very difficult to do that. But it is something, and I think in Janine's talk, she would have mentioned a lot of that, is that we've got to look at it from an individual basis. And we've got to consider load, because again, what we've done is this pendulum has swung from, we have this fear of too much load, and too much load creates injury, but we've swung the other way and there's not enough load. So we're going to get injured in any case. So there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. And I think, unfortunately, the sweet spot is dependent on a number of factors. And again, I would go back to the coaches. The coaches are the people that are most in the best position to make decisions on that, because they know their players better than anything else. They can see when they're lethargic. They can see when they're tired. Yes, we've got simple measures. There's simple measures about heart rates, and so there's some quite easy objective measures that we can do and we can take. But the reality is, the coach, if he's really in tune with that player, and he understands that player, and he's been watching, he can understand different movements, how he works, how much energy he has, how he's talking back, etc., etc. So unfortunately, I think it's going to fall back into the hands of the coach to say, well, there's all this information, but at this level, I've got to deal with one player at a time.
One of the things that I often say to coaches, particularly high school coaches, because if they've got a good player, he's often playing provincial sport as well. So his load is huge. And I think what happens sometimes is, well, the school coach and the provincial coach are often at loggerheads, because, well, it's the big derby game on the weekend. So, let's pull back on provincial, but the provincial coach has got his own issues. So I think what is really important is that that whatever team you're coaching, whether you're a high school of the under 16A team and you've got somebody who's playing provincial sport, look at his load, understand how many times he's going to practice, understand if he's training with a biokineticist at the same time and going to gym and doing provincial load, and understand everybody's load. And that's where I talk about accountability. Like, I think we often say, well, it should be the provincial coach's responsibility. If he's not taking responsibility as the high school coach, you need to. So those are simple ways that you can start to address it.
And I think it also, a lot of it comes to the communications between the different, and engaging with the different coaches. So, I mean, some players may have 3 or 4 coaches. They've got private coaches, and they've got, school, provincial, etc. So it's about someone taking that accountability and communicating with the player, and communicating, obviously, at school level with the parents involved as well. So it's about the education and communication.
I do also think that as a collective, as a coaching body, we've also got to be better, because you can't just go to practice. Each practice needs to have a focus. And I think that's something that we would be better at, and we would find this overtraining wouldn't exist to the same extent if we understood that this is not just a practice session, and we weren't just going to practice 3 times a week. There's a technical practice. There's a game-based practice. If we could start identifying what the metabolic aim of each practice was, you would then see that there'd be some practices which were really intense, other practices which are more technical and patterns played. So I think it becomes important for the fraternity of coaches to also look at that and say, geez, we've got a huge role to play in that. Because if you are going high, low days or technical days, you negate the fact, to a large extent, you will negate a lot of those concerns that we have about just the load, because the load becomes a problem, because every time you go to practice, everybody's trying to get the maximum out of that particular player.
One of the brilliant examples of this, and I mean, I suppose it's a whole talk on its own, but in the last few years, intensity of practice has become, that's the buzzword. You've got to be as close to match play intensity at practice and stuff. So what they've done is, they used to have a 2-hour soccer practice. They've now realized intensity has to be greater, but they haven't dropped the duration. So they now have upped the intensity, but they still practice for 2 hours. That increases your load substantially. So if you have a high intensity practice, drop the duration. So there are really clever ways that you can adapt that and be more specific and prevent overtraining.